Welcome back to the Universalis podcast. I am Martin Kochański, the creator of Universalis, and in this episode I'll be looking at the highlights of the week ahead, starting with Sunday the 6th of July. Friday the 11th is the feast of St. Benedict. He is one of the patron saints of Europe, but he could easily be considered the patron saint of the whole of Western civilization. Without him, there might not have been any Western civilization at all. Benedict was born in 480 AD, not far from Rome, shortly after the last Roman emperor had retired into private life and a barbarian king had begun to rule in his place. The fall of the Roman Empire was more of a slow deflation than a crash, and Rome in Benedict's time was still busy and still civilized. He lived there till he was 20 and then left the city to find a quiet, isolated place where he could live a religious life away from urban distractions. He settled near Subiaco in the mountains a few days' journey from Rome. Benedict's reputation for holiness grew. The monks of a nearby monastery heard of this holy hermit. They had slipped into rather a lazy and comfortable way of life, and they invited him to become their abbot and reform them. Such a rhythm of backsliding and reform is a common one in the history of religion. Benedict agreed to become their abbot, whereupon, faced with the prospect of having to live the reformed way of life they themselves had asked for, the monks tried to poison him. Wanting to be a disciplined person, without being disciplined, is a universal human characteristic, not only a religious one. In time, Benedict went on to found monasteries himself. The final one was at Monte Cassino, south of Rome, where he died on the 21st of March 547. His monastery flourished for almost a millennium and a half, rebuilding itself after each barbarian invasion, until it was bombed into rubble by the Americans in 1944. So far, Benedict's biography follows the fairly standard pattern of was born, was good, did holy things, died, of so many monastic saints. If that had been all, we might still be celebrating him in the calendar, but then again we might not. In one sense there was nothing new about Benedict. There had been hermits before, and groupings of hermits which turned in the end into communities of one kind or another. St. Augustine gathered such a community round him when he was Bishop of Hippo in Africa. It became a common thing for bishops to do. In the 4th century, St. Basil the Great founded monasteries which had orphanages attached to them, and hospitals, and workshops for the unemployed poor. What was new about Benedict, what changed the history of Europe and the world, was this. He created a rule for monks to live by. We call it the rule of St. Benedict. A rule sounds a dead thing compared to people, in this case compared to abbots, to monks, to whole communities. We know this all too well because we have too many rules nowadays, and they are dead rules designed to keep us under control and nothing more. There is nothing human about those rules. Even the creators of the rules are anonymous and collective, not individual human beings. Given all that, the idea of celebrating a rule sounds absurd to us, and so does the idea of celebrating someone for having written a rule. The thing about the rule of St. Benedict is that it is not a dead rule, a rule of control. It is a living rule, a rule of life. It says, structure your community like this, and it will have life, and so will the people in it. The rule is not for good or perfect people, because most people aren't good or perfect. It is for people who seek to be better than they are, and it knows that they won't be particularly good to start with. This rule is not a rule for athletes. Benedict himself calls it a rule for beginners. If you look at any community and want to know how it ticks, you start by looking at what keeps it together, and in particular at how the power works. What keeps a Benedictine community together is the vows every member takes on joining it. They are vows of poverty, stability, and obedience. Each of these is important. The vow of personal poverty means people aren't saying every moment, "That's mine, not yours." You can't have the rich looking down on the poor, or the poor looking down from a moral height on the rich. You can't have the richer monks gaining respect and influence from their riches. Poverty is still taken very seriously in Benedictine communities. The monks may not sleep in dormitories anymore, and they may not live for half the year on raw vegetables, but still, I remember my housemaster, Dom Denis, having to declare every 3 years everything he had and what he had it for. For instance, he had to declare 3 electric kettles, one for himself as housemaster, one for the boys in his house, and one for the projectionists to use in the cinema. This level of detail may seem to you to be absurd, but it makes a point. The thing about possessions is that they possess you. Poverty is freedom, and it is part of the job of a monk to be free. The vow of stability means that when things get difficult, you can't start thinking about how much greener the grass must be on the other side of the fence. You can't go skipping from place to place looking for somewhere where they will truly appreciate you and give you everything you want. By vowing stability, you are freed from all distractions of that kind, so you can concentrate on the job Providence has given you, which is to live in the here and the now. The vow of obedience sounds the oddest to us who are not monks. The idea that I should ever for an instant consider doing anything that I don't feel like doing because someone else tells me to, that is an infringement of my liberty. It stands in the way of my very own personal fulfillment. It is blasphemy against the religion of the cult of me, which we laugh at when we see it in other people, but in private follow fervently ourselves. Perhaps a sporting analogy may make obedience more acceptable. If I decide to get fit, I may engage a trainer to help me do it. Then I obey my trainer. If he tells me to step, I step. If he tells me to jump, I jump. I do not feel dominated or oppressed or unjustly deprived of my freedom. I have committed myself to a goal, and I follow what is needed to reach that goal. And I trust my trainer to give me only instructions that he thinks will benefit me. I choose my trainer, then I obey him. Monks elect their abbot, then they obey him. That is the first thing to remember about the vow of obedience. The second thing to remember is the name of the person the monks have vowed to obey. The name abbot, the word in Latin is abbas, comes from the Abba, father of the Gospels. The abbot is the elected father of the community. The rule of St. Benedict says, "Let him seek to be loved, not feared," and also, "Let him act according to the character and understanding of each of the community, so that the strong wish to follow him and the weak are not discouraged." The abbot has no God-given right to be obeyed. That is obvious. His right to be obeyed has been given to him by the community he governs. Each monk took a vow of obedience on entering, and each monk, participating in the election of the abbot, decides who it is that he is vowed to obey. To put it another way, the right to tell us what to do comes from us, just as when I engage a sports coach to train me, I confer the right on him to make me do things even if I would rather not do them. In both the monastery and the gym, if I disobey, I am in the end really only disobeying myself. If you drew an organization chart of a monastery, you might draw it like that of a corporation, with the abbot at the top and the monks below. But you could equally well draw it with the monks at the top and the abbot below, because the abbot is at the service of the monks. You could take the metaphor further and say that the abbot needs to be underneath the monks because he is the support of each of them. Indeed, the rule of St. Benedict insists that the youngest and most junior should be listened to just as much as anyone else. It can't be a question of me up here, you down there. It is not an accident that the very first word of the rule is ausculta, listen. There had been monasteries before Benedict, and there had been rules before, some severe, some relaxed. They mostly faded away once the rule of St. Benedict came along. Soon it was hard to remember a time when monasteries had not been Benedictine. Most of us are not monks or nuns, but that doesn't make St. Benedict irrelevant, or his rule. We all live in communities. A family is a community, a small one. A business is a community, though not a lifelong one. So is a school or a university. All our significant interactions with other people are essentially community ones. The rule of St. Benedict has lessons for all of us in constructing communities that have life in them, ones that make us live rather than controlling us. But let's have a very quick journey through the history first. Monks do not only pray, they work as well. They spend a third of the day working. Benedict himself thought mostly in terms of agricultural work, but soon the work of the mind made an appearance. For one thing, monks needed to study and new monks needed to be taught. For this to happen, they needed books, and books needed to be preserved. Whenever a manuscript began to fade or crumble or go mouldy or get nibbled by mice, someone would sit in the scriptorium patiently, hour by hour, in uncertain light and with fingers numb with the cold, making new copies so that the learning should not be lost. And it was not only religious works. The poems of Horace, the epics of Virgil, the erotic verse of Ovid, the speeches of Cicero, the histories of Tacitus, whatever has survived of the literature and culture of the ancient world has survived because of the monks. There was no one else to do it. For centuries the monasteries were islands of learning among the chaos, and when Europe was calm again and beginning to wake up and be able to think, it could take what they had preserved for it. I can't compress more than 1,000 years of history into a couple of minutes of podcast, but you can imagine the patterns that evolved. Some monasteries became fat and lazy, then a group of monks might leave in order to set up a foundation on stricter and purer lines. A monastery might become rich, for instance, breeding sheep on poor land nobody else wanted. Then a local magnate would try to steal its land, or steal the whole thing by putting his 6-year-old son in as abbot. Women found the monastic life had scope for an independent, respected identity, not just as continuers of dynasties, or units of exchange in marriage alliances, or overworked poor relations in the families of their cousins. Of course, in the long term, everyone hates the monasteries, if they are prosperous, for their possessions, but in any case for their independence. In England, King Henry VIII closed them all and gave their assets to his friends. Since some 10% of England's population had been supported by the charity of the monks, that meant that a lot of people were thrown out to try to make a living by robbery or simply to die of starvation in the hedgerows. Every enlightened ruler from Napoleon onwards has closed monasteries or banned them. In 19th century England, the church hierarchy fought vigorously to take the monastery buildings over for its own purposes. In the 21st century, the Benedictines' emphasis on education made it easy for the state to cut the foundations of their communities to pieces. And of course there is the spirit of the age to be reckoned with. Nobody now feels capable of commitment. Marriage, as an indissoluble state, is illegal all across the world. On a much smaller scale, we are each so unconfident of our ability to live up our promises that I feel brave even accepting an invitation to a party nowadays. What will I do if the day arrives and I don't feel like going anymore? When you hear of this or that monastery fading or failing, like the castor oil plant the prophet Jonah sheltered under until God made it wilt to show him who was boss, do feel sorry and do pray about it, but remember also what unpromising material we all are nowadays, weak, lacking in fortitude, with no concept of commitment because nobody else in our society has any. This mustn't be an excuse, but it can be a consolation. While we pray to be given enough guts to do something with our lives, instead of drifting along with the current or spinning round and round like a leaf in a whirlpool, let's follow what we can of St. Benedict's rule. Even if we are not formally bound to a community by vows, these are rules that will give life. First of all comes the Divine Office, which we also call the Liturgy of the Hours, or even Opus Dei, the work of God. The reason we have these 7 hours spread through the day, the Office of Readings, which used to be called Matins, Lauds, Terce, Sext, None, Vespers, and Compline, is that this is what the monks have, and the monks have it because it is good, steady, spiritual nutrition spread through the day. Like the rest of the rule, it is not too hard and not too much. Even if you did every hour every day, you would probably still spend less time praying than eating. And now I have to advertise, because if you haven't got the Divine Office in your pocket, you should. Get Universalis if you haven't got it. And now I have to advertise again, because I strongly recommend that you listen as well as read. Universalis on any mobile device will let you do this, and the subscription costs less than a cup of coffee per month. You may think that it is deeper and holier to read than to listen, and deeper and holier still to read slowly and with reflection. No doubt, but the best is the enemy of the good. Screens encourage speed reading and skimming, not reflection. You think you've read it, but you haven't, and sooner or later you realize you haven't, and you give up trying. The great thing about listening is that you will actually do it. You will do it when making breakfast, or on your way to work, or taking a break from work, or at bedtime in the dark. You can make it a habit, and the good thing about habits is that once they're established, they require hardly any willpower to keep them up. By the way, this is the last part of the advertisement. If you haven't subscribed to the Spoken Hours before, Apple and Google will give you your first month free. You can think of it as a 1-month novitiate. That is the liturgical part of the rule. Now comes the part you should regulate your whole life by, the rule's understanding of authority and power. I can put it in 3 words. Authority is service. So when you are in authority over people, Benedict tells you you are their servant. Do what the rule says. Lead the strong, encourage the weak, and above all, listen. On the other hand, if someone is in authority over you, that someone is your servant. If he does not do what the rule says, he is doing wrong. And what do you always do about a servant who does not do his job well? You don't sit around grumbling to your friends. Treat your servant boss as you would any other inadequate servant and teach him how to serve you better. Finally, let's look at the other side. I have talked about a fading age where the concept of commitment is lost and where the spirit of a community fades. But the opposite can happen, equally inexplicably. One can't see why a community should suddenly burgeon and flower, and yet the spirit strikes, and it does. Joining a monastery is never an easy way out of the troubles of life. It is tough. The monastic vocation has always been a heroic one. Compare it to marriage. Marrying one person takes a lot of courage. Marrying a whole monastery of them for life could well take more courage still. Tough it may be, but the reward is great. Perhaps today's society thinks it has abolished heroism, but God has always raised up heroes before in the most unexpected places. Let's remind him to do it again. That's all for this week. If you'd like to write to us about anything, send an email to universalis@universalis.com. We look forward to hearing from you. Have a good week in every sense, and let's pray for one another.